my name is Vince Randazzo, and I'm a policy advisor to NDSS. I'm going to quickly, because I hear so many of you didn't hear what was discussed, I'm going to skip over a lot of what I had said earlier so we can get to our friends at NIH, who are kind enough to spend this hour with us to talk about research at NIH. Let me just briefly say, you guys all know how to ask questions there in the corner. As we go through this presentation, we'll have a Q&A there at the end. And we're grateful for their participation. This is just really briefly, for those who didn't hear, there was a great Appropriations Committee hearing on Wednesday, and we're thankful for all the witnesses who participated, into all of the families and self-advocates who showed up for that to make a strong statement on research to members of Congress. And so what we thought would be helpful to our community is to also have this webinar with NIH to just get a quick update on their activities related to Down syndrome research. And so their names are up there. I'm gonna stop talking because we want to get their presentation. And so let me turn it over to Melissa again to start this. And again, I apologize to everyone.
Can you hear us okay now?
Yes, it's working.
All right, great. So thank you, Vince, and the team at the National Down Syndrome Society for sponsoring this webinar on research activities that have been supported by the National Institutes of Health. I'm here with my colleagues, and we'll go ahead and go through the outline of the presentation on the next slide. So I'm first going to tell you a little bit about some of our research activities and also give you some information about Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. And then my colleague, Dr. Sujata Bardhan, will be talking about DS Connect, the Down Syndrome Registry, and the research it supports. And then finally, Lisa Kaiser will be providing some information about funding for Down syndrome research, as well as information about the Down Syndrome Consortium and the working group. Next slide. So I think, as many of you in the audience know, the lifespan for people with Down syndrome has been increasing dramatically since 1959. And in fact, if you look at the chart shown on this slide, in 1959, the average life expectancy for a person with Down syndrome was only 9 years. In 1983, that had risen to 25 years, and in 2007, the life expectancy was 50 years, and it's probably even a little higher than that now. This represents an over 450% increase from 1959, and a large part of the reason for this increase in lifespan has been related to the medical advances that have been made in both understanding Down syndrome and treating some of the medical conditions that occur in Down syndrome, such as some of the congenital heart defects, thyroid problems, and other issues. So I think we would all agree that there's a real important role for research in helping us to improve the lifespans for people with Down syndrome. Next slide. And this is an outline of what I want to cover in the next few slides: the research plan on Down syndrome, some of the resources that have been created by NIH to support scientists who are studying Down syndrome, and then Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, as well as the DS Connect registry. Next slide. The NIH research plan on Down syndrome is known as Down Syndrome Directions, and this was revised in 2014. It is available on the NIH website, and we'd be happy to provide that link if anyone is interested. There are 5 major research areas that are covered within the research plan, including understanding the pathophysiology and disease progression in Down syndrome, learning more about screening, diagnosis, and functional measures for people with Down syndrome, treatment and management issues, Down syndrome and aging, which is the the portion of the research plan that was added most recently, and then finally research infrastructure or supporting mechanisms for research. The goal of the research plan is really to develop research objectives that will guide NIH's funding for research, and also give advice to investigators about where we see the research priorities. This was developed with input from the community, and so represents a living document, which we continue to periodically revise. I would note that there are over 300 articles that are cited within the bibliography of this research plan, that really have arisen and been published as a result of NIH funding for Down syndrome research. Next slide. One of the areas where we're providing supports for investigators who study Down syndrome is in the creation of mouse models. The NIH supports a repository of different mouse models that are designed to actually represent some of the features of Down syndrome. There are several different models that have been developed, and the illustration here shows you one of the models. This is the TS65DN mouse, and if you look in the lower left corner with those spread of those little squiggly worm-like images, those are actually chromosomes, and there's an extra copy of a chromosome 16 for mice, which is essentially contains much of the material that's found on human chromosome 21. The Down syndrome model mice, if you look at the smaller mouse on the left side in comparison to its littermate that does not have this chromosomal difference, is that these mice are smaller, they have certain differences in their craniofacial structures, and they have developmental delays as well as some problems with learning and behavioral issues. So we can learn a lot from studying mouse models that help us understand more about Down syndrome in humans. And in fact, it gives us an opportunity to also explore some of the issues such as the development of Alzheimer's disease, which can also be replicated in mouse models of Down syndrome. So the goal of this resource is really to make new and existing models available to the investigator community so that they can continue to study Down syndrome. Next slide, please. Another aspect of activities related to Down syndrome is in the development of guidelines and frameworks for developing outcome measures that will inform clinical trials in Down syndrome. So about 2 years ago, we organized and co-sponsored a workshop with the National Down Syndrome Society to address some of the challenges in evaluating outcomes of interventions in the Down syndrome population. So there were 3 working groups that were formed to inform this activity, focusing on cognition as well as some of the behavioral, social, and emotional issues in Down syndrome, and finally some of the medical and physical issues. There was a paper published earlier this year which really describes the work of the first 2 of those 3 working groups to help identify outcomes that are going to be robust enough to show a difference when treatments are utilized for people with Down syndrome. If you don't have good outcome measures that show that your treatment is making a difference, then there's really no point in actually pursuing the treatment. So these are really important components of some of the research studies and research infrastructure that NIH is supporting. Next slide. With regard to Alzheimer's disease in individuals with Down syndrome, we recognize, and most of you who are on this webinar probably realize, that because of having 3 copies of chromosome 21, people with Down syndrome are at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia as they age. So the NIH, and if you could also click a few more times, is funding a biomarker study, which is looking at what we call biomarkers. These are markers of the condition that include cognitive or intellectual functioning, brain imaging scans, genetic testing, and other blood markers to help us understand what the causes of brain abnormalities are in people with Down syndrome that can lead them to develop Alzheimer's disease. These studies are going to be using observations to measure cognitive changes over time, and these types of studies will also help us develop, we hope, clinical trials that will allow us to test treatments for dementia in adults with Down syndrome. Keep clicking once or twice more. This initiative, led by NIH, is co-funded by the National Institute on Aging as well as Child Health Institute, and we are investing over $37 million over 5 years to support these studies. The official name of the program is the Alzheimer's Biomarkers Consortium of Down Syndrome, or ABCDS study. Next slide. And this slide just summarizes the different sites that are recruiting subjects to participate in this study. They are currently enrolling over 500 Down syndrome volunteers, plus several sets of healthy siblings for some of the sites. And the age of adults that are being recruited with Down syndrome is those over the age of 25 for several of the recruitment sites and over the age of 40 for some of the other recruitment sites. But they've harmonized their data sets, so they're going to be working together to look at the outcomes for adults with Down syndrome. If you're interested, again, in any of these slides or in contacting any of the different 8 locations where they are currently recruiting for participants in these studies, please let us know if you need further information. And then finally, next slide. One other resource that we are supporting at NIH is one focusing on biobanking. There are currently a number of efforts related to trying to create a Down syndrome specific biobank that can collect blood or saliva samples for DNA-based studies, but also can collect other types of tissues that can help with studying Down syndrome and some of the issues related to Down syndrome. In addition, we've been funding the Brain and Tissue Bank at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, which has been collecting brain and other tissues from people with over 400 different developmental disorders. This represents one of the largest repository of Down syndrome tissue in the United States, and this tissue is made available to investigators around the world to help with their research studies. The Brain and Tissue Bank at the University of Maryland is actually a part of the NIH NeuroBiobank, which is also interested in banking tissues from adults with Down syndrome with and without Alzheimer's disease. And finally, we're partnering with our colleagues at the National Institute on Aging to ensure that the Alzheimer's disease centers have an opportunity to also collect samples from individuals with Down syndrome. So with these coordinated efforts, we really hope to advance an understanding of some of the brain changes that occur in adults with Down syndrome. That's it for me, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Barden, who's going to tell you a little bit about DS-Connect.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to just give a brief overview about the registry. So this was, again, from feedback from the Down syndrome community and the DS consortium that a registry for Down syndrome was needed. So NIH took the lead and we created this registry. Next slide, please. And what the registry is, it's really a secure and confidential online database that collects basic health information and demographic of people with Down syndrome. Can you please click a few more times? This collects health information and demographic for people globally, and this not only enables participants to look at all the aggregate de-identified data, but it also helps professionals, approved professionals, to look at the same aggregate data, and that can help them develop studies for their research projects. This can, for families, this actually connects them to other healthcare providers, and they can participate in surveys that actually help in us better understand the health of people with DS across their lifespan. We also have a way for researchers to recruit through the registry for their studies, including surveys, and I will show you a brief summary of some of the research projects that we have supported. Next slide, please. So this is the new homepage. We just launched a responsive web template to help participants be able to view the website through their mobile device. This was also feedback from a lot of participants to be able to access the website using different mobile devices. We launched, it's almost 4 years ago that we launched, and we have been doing a lot of additions to the registry since we launched. We launched a Spanish version after we launched the English site. And then we also launched the professional portal in 2014, which actually is a portal for professionals to request access and to view the aggregate de-identified data. Next slide, please. A lot of our focus is not just to encourage participants to register, but also to ensure that the data that individuals are entering are secure. So we spend a lot of time and investment in making sure that the security controls are in place. The registry actually operates on a FISMA moderate level, which just means there are a lot of security controls that needs to be checked periodically. There is information is encrypted, password requirements, which we have addressed in our newsletter. It's annoying, but it's really needed to change password once every year to keep the data secure. We also try not to collect social security information and personal bank information. It's really the demographic and health information that is actually requested of a participant. We have also made sure that only a handful of people have access to the individual data. Just pointing out that we have a newly revised consent form, again, trying to adhere to the new policies on consenting, trying to make sure that that's streamlined for our online participants. Next slide. So this is an example of how all of the questionnaires within the registry is a participant is able to see all of the aggregate de-identified data as pie charts and bar graphs. And here you cannot see it, but actually if you hover over each of the bars, it actually shows you how many people responded. This is also the similar view that a professional has and a researcher has, so they would be able to see how many people say have sleep apnea and how many have snoring issues. So this is also useful for a researcher to think of a research of their research project and how they will be able to use DS Connect to recruit. Next slide, please. So outreach is a big part of our work as well, and with our DS consortium partners who also really help us in trying to outreach the registry and promote the registry. We have over 3,000 participants from the North America, and globally we have close to 200, a little less than 200 participants. So we are actively promoting the registry, and the more participants we have, the better the data will be and the more useful it will be for the community. Next slide, please. Just showing you some examples of research projects that the Down Syndrome Connect Registry has been able to support. We have supported over 15 researchers since the professional portal was launched in 2014. Here are listed some of the examples. Dr. Penny Feldman was studying thyroid issues and whether screening needs to be done in earlier and in infants with DS. And we had helped her to recruit through the registry. We also helped Dr. Jamie Edgen, who was looking at sleep issues, a very important topic, and we helped her recruit through the registry. Melissa already mentioned our partnership with National Institute of Aging and all of the investigators. We are trying to help them to recruit through the registry as well. Next slide, please. This is, again, I'll not read through each of them, but you can see the different sort of research projects that we have been supporting. There is a process for the investigator to request access. We have a very robust committee called Research Review Committee that actually reviews the access requests from the researchers, and they actually look at the research that is being that the investigator needs to access the DS Connect participants for, and only after their approval we send out notifications to participants. Next slide, please. This is just showing that some of the studies that we supported early 2015 have now started publishing their results, and hopefully with continued participation, not just from the DS community, but also from researchers, we'll be able to help help the researchers recruit and help them to find new things that would be helpful for the DS community. Next slide, please. This is a slide which was actually provided to us by the researcher, Dr. Amy Luanda, was trying to study the use of nutritional supplements in children with DS. And if you look at the graph on the top half of the slide, she was having issues recruiting for her study, and her goal was 500 participants. That was in February 2017. She contacted us. Her proposal was reviewed by the research committee and then approved. We sent out a notification in July 2017, and within 2 weeks, she actually not only met her goal, but she had to move her goal to 1,000 participants because she got so many parents who completed her survey and actually wanted to participate even though she had met her goal. So this is just to show you the power of the registry, and also how parents can actually fill out survey-based studies from the comfort of their home, and that's also participating in research and how that actually benefits both the community and the researcher as well. So next slide, please. So this is, again, outreach is a big part to keep this resource useful for the community. Please sign up if you have not already. If you are a participant, thank you very much for your support. Do spread the word. Our communication team has developed excellent electronic toolkits, which is freely available. And if you email or let us know, we will share those. And there are different material for Facebook, tweets, flyers, Instagram, you name it, we would have something to share with you. The homepage actually shows the gauge, and we really hope to reach 5,000 and keep the needle moving. I will pass on the slides to Lisa Kaiser now for the next part. Thank you. So next slide, please. Next one.
So a lot of people ask about funding for Down syndrome, especially through the National Institutes of Health, because of course we are taxpayer funded, meaning your money. So thank you very much for that. A lot of people don't realize, however, that over 80% of NIH funding is actually distributed to universities and other academic sites around the country. And that the way that we do that is that scientists submit to the NIH research applications for either grants or contracts. And usually it's actually with their own ideas, that they have an idea, like some of the researchers that Sujata was just describing. They want to look into something pertaining, say, to Down syndrome. And so they submit an application to us. These applications go through a fairly arduous peer review process. There are 2 different peer review groups that review the application for its scientific merit, and then ultimately the institutes where the applications land decide whether they have enough money to fund those particular applications. So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people don't realize that this really is a very rigorous process, and it really is good because it ensures that we spend our taxpayer dollars wisely. Each institute, we're just one of the 27 institutes and centers at NIH, and we fund research on a whole range of things. As you can imagine, the Institute of Child Health and Human Development, that's pretty broad. So we fund research on issues such as birth defects, endometriosis, Zika, preterm birth, rehabilitation, and of course, intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. The take-home message from this slide is that the researcher, you see the researcher there at the center, the researcher actually has a lot of resources, him or herself, when they're submitting a grant application. The major one being the program staff. These are scientists like Drs. Parisi and Barden who talk to researchers and help them they talk through their research ideas, they help them, they don't write their application for them, but they certainly help them through the process. Part of the other big message that I'd like you to realize from this slide is that the review staff, those who are reviewing the grant applications, are completely separate from the scientists such as Drs. Parisi and Barden. And the reason that's so important is that you don't want people to play favorites. You want to make sure that everyone kind of comes in on a equal level to get their ideas funded. So next slide, please. Here's some of the recent history on research funding for Down syndrome. This institute, actually, to be honest, has probably been funding research on Down syndrome since the 1960s when the institute was founded. But in recent years, it's stayed fairly steady. You'll see a couple of blips in 2009 and 2010. Many of you may recall that in the early days of the Obama administration, we had the ERA grants. That was extra funding that was put into federal government, and we were able to fund some additional Down syndrome research then. Then the funding, once those grants were done, the funding sort of stayed steady at a slightly lower level, partly because the NIH budget overall did not receive an increase in those years. And then very nicely, you'll see toward the end, between 2015 and 2016, funding for Down syndrome research actually at NIH has gone up. And so we're very pleased about that. A good portion of that, of course, is what Dr. Parisi alluded to earlier, this new big biomarker study that NICHD is funding along with the National Institute on Aging. So we are very excited about that, because that's going to have a lot of implications. Next slide. This is just another way of looking at it. This breaks down, the big message here is that while NICHD, this institute, certainly funds a good chunk of the Down syndrome research, other institutes at NIH, and I won't go through all of these acronyms, but other institutes fund their own, aspects of Down syndrome research that are related to their own special areas of expertise. NINDS is the Neurology Institute, NCI is Cancer, NIDCD is Deafness, NEI is the Eye Institute, and so on. So we work very, very closely together. Next slide. This will just show you, we've made a real effort over the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years to help coordinate Down syndrome research. Of course, we don't want to duplicate efforts. We also want to maximize our funding and our expertise. So on the left column, you will see the NIH Down Syndrome Working Group. That's all of the 11 NIH institutes and centers. That's pretty good, 11 out of 27, who are very involved. And in fact, we just met last week to talk about some issues. So they all fund their own special areas of expertise, but we do work together to make sure. Sometimes we, say, fund a grant together or sponsor a conference together, that sort of thing. In addition, then, the NIH Down Syndrome Working Group combines with and welcomes the larger Down Syndrome Consortium, and you will see all of the national and international organizations, including NDSS, that are members of the consortium. This consortium's been in place since 2011, and we have a formal memorandum of understanding. The consortium has been enormously helpful on reaching out, helping to help people be aware of DS Connect. We received tremendous amounts of input on the most recent research plan. It's really been a fantastic partnership, and we are always looking for more interest. We also, I just want to point out, have two self-advocates on the panel, and they bring a perspective that is invaluable. Next slide. This is my last slide, and then we can move on to questions. I wanted to mention a couple of things, but particularly, it's really wonderful to see. There is a wave of interest at NIH in including people in research who not traditionally been included in research. Some of you who are as old as I am might remember that just 20 years ago, women were not routinely included in clinical research studies. Up until just very recently, most studies do not include children. And that's even for drugs, for example, that are prescribed just to children. It's kind of amazing. So there is this new set of conversations and discussions going on at the NIH about how to reach beyond sort of the traditional way of doing research and including all of our population. And that certainly includes people with disabilities of all kinds, both physical, intellectual, and developmental. So we're very excited about that. We just, as I say, discussed this with the Down Syndrome Working Group last week, and I think there will be much, much more to come. As we're developing new policies, we definitely will be reaching out to the Down syndrome community. So I wanted to thank you all. It is Down Syndrome Awareness Month, and so we appreciate the opportunity to help you be aware of our efforts here. And I wanted to thank the National Down Syndrome Society for making this possible.
Great, wonderful. So thank you, Ms. Sigarda and Melissa. If you have a few minutes to stick around for some questions, I just want to remind everybody, if there is a question you want to ask, type it in there over in that on the right hand side under questions, and we will get to that. And as we accumulate some of those, I just want to kind of again apologize for the audio trouble early on. I wanted to make sure that our friends at NIH had the time to get their presentation, and so I just want to mention a couple things that I had said earlier that people did not hear, that I just want to make sure, you know, we get on the record. And one of them is just a reminder to those of you who did not get a chance to see the House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing on Wednesday, which focused on the state of the science around Down syndrome research. In our announcement about this webinar, there's a link to the subcommittee website, and where you can go and you can download the testimony. It's all up there, and then there is a archived video showing the hearing. And so, you know, if you hadn't seen it, I really want to encourage you all to do it, because it was a phenomenal hearing, and it really, I thought, brought a lot of much needed attention to the need for an increased commitment to advancing research into the medical and other conditions associated with Down syndrome. And I thought, you know, I just want again to express our gratitude to the witnesses who had testified at that hearing, and they did a really amazing job representing our community. And I especially, you know, and I also want to express our gratitude to all those self-advocates and their families who came from throughout the country to be in that room to really, really highlight the importance of this issue to their members of Congress. And so, you know, we thought that a great addition or a great complement to that hearing would be to have this webinar with our friends at NIH to kind of talk about what they're doing on research. And so we're really, really thankful for them to take the time to do this. One of the things that, and I see a couple questions coming in, and as we accumulate, there's one that I want to sort of ask, if you don't mind, which is, you know, DS Connect, which is a great investment on behalf of the Down syndrome community by NIH. I think you guys spend about $1 million a year on that. Now, there was Sigarda mentioned only about less than 5,000 people have signed up for it, which I think that was your goal, which means probably substantially less have done so. Why is being part of DS Connect in our community, why is that important for let's say people who are concerned about the amount of funding that's going for Down syndrome research? Is there a connection between participation in our community in this and how NIH views or looks at research funding? Is there a connection there? I just wanted to ask. And is 5,000 really the goal we're looking for?
So Vince, thank you for that question. I think our goal is much larger, but if we, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are the government and we do get a lot of questions about how secure is the data, why is the government collecting all of this information, and this is the way how it is. It's online. It's an online registry, and that's why I did show the slide about security. We are, cognizant of the fact that there is a lot of health information that is collected. We try to minimize the number of required questions. So, we try not to collect home addresses. We try to collect emails and things like that instead of, actual physical address. And researchers actually have to show that they can recruit for their research project to get NIH funding. And I think that's why not only security but outreach is a big part of the work we do to start that dialogue that, this is a two-way street. We definitely want the community engaged, and our consortium partners, including yourself, actually help us in outreach and trying to spread the word about the registry. And to be very honest, 4 years ago, we were having a different sort of conversation when, we had to defend the registry and why the government was creating this registry. And now the discussion has definitely moved away from that. But, this was a need that the community and the DS consortium together, came up with, that this registry is needed to move the DS research field forward. Without willing participants, researchers cannot recruit, and it's a cycle. If they cannot recruit, then the study that they want funding for cannot get funded because there are no participants. So, I didn't mean to say that we want to stop at 5,000, but, the needle is moving slowly, and we don't want to be overambitious. And, once we reach 5,000, our goal will also move with that.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I think your goal should be 10,000, but we'll take 5,000 right now, right?
Yes. The more the better.
Yep. And one question that we got several that came in, and just to let everyone know, if we don't get to your question, we will get them answered to you either way, either on this part of this webinar or separately. But one question was, in selecting grant awardees, how does the NIH make sure that researchers feel encouraged to submit applications for new types of research, new approaches, new ideas versus what might be seen as a popular or mainstream idea? It says, I don't know that this is an issue, but for example, a researcher may be more cautious or reluctant. Maybe more cautious, or did I lose this? I'm sorry, let me find this here. I'm sorry. Okay. So, for example, a researcher may be more cautious or reluctant to submit topics in previously unfunded areas of Down syndrome research in order to increase the chances of being awarded. Does that make sense?
Yes. So, Vince, I think that this is an important question. And really, when we fund research at NIH, we look for people who have good ideas, that have well thought out research plans, and that actually are going to have a high impact. There are many different mechanisms that we use to encourage research. Some of them we encourage high risk, high reward types of projects. Other particular funding announcements relate to what we call our R01s, which are sort of the standard 5-year NIH award that is most commonly employed across the NIH and all 27 institutes and centers. But the bottom line is that we encourage all investigators that are interested in proposing research projects and putting in applications to talk with us program staff, because we can work with investigators, give them feedback about their research ideas, and help them ensure that what they're proposing is going to have the greatest chance of success, and it's going to be targeted in the right type of funding announcement, the right type of research, and the right study section that's going to be best qualified to review those applications. So we do encourage people who have novel ideas. We just want to make sure that they're applying to the right types of applications. And there's just a huge variety at NIH.
Okay. Another question related to your chart from the registry, where the number of narcolepsy was very small. What do you attribute the reason for that?
So you're referring to the data the sleep data.
Yes.
Well, I mean, this is really reflecting what people have put into the registry. So if narcolepsy is a more significant problem, I can't tell how large that little blue blip is. There are probably at least a handful of people who've indicated that narcolepsy is a problem for their loved one with Down syndrome. But if this is more of an issue, we encourage people to go on to DS Connect, sign up, and fill out the surveys specifically so we can learn more about what some of the medical issues and concerns are.
Well, because the more people who identify this as an issue, the whole, as Sujata was pointing out, we have this professional portal. Researchers can go online and they can look at the unidentified data and say, narcolepsy looks like it's more of a problem than I thought. I might think about putting in an application to explore this. So it becomes almost a helpful feedback system.
Okay, thank you. One question is, I don't know if you assume you know the answer to this, or well, I'll ask it. How is the fluoxetine study progressing?
The what study?
The fluoxetine study. Is there a fluoxetine study?
Fluoxetine, I think.
Yeah, fluoxetine.
Yeah. So yeah, fluoxetine is an antidepressant, common one, like Valium. No, and I think it's Prozac. Prozac, yes. I think that's the generic name for Prozac. And so that particular study is not one that is currently a part of the DS Connect, part of the registry. And I don't believe that NIH is currently funding that particular project. If it's the one that I'm thinking about, it's based in Texas. But I would say if someone is interested in knowing more about that, to contact the investigators that are leading those studies. Yeah, that's true. And one thing to point out is that anyone who has NIH funding is required to register their clinical studies, their clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov. That's actually the website, I think, on the very last slide. And essentially, if you're interested in knowing what kinds of clinical trials exist for Down syndrome, it's the slide, right there, clinicaltrials.gov. I would encourage you to go to that website and search under Down syndrome. You can also add additional search functions and fields and learn about the types of research that are being done throughout the country and sometimes throughout the world.
Okay. And, go ahead. Sorry.
Vince, I just wanted to add to a comment. I was looking at the question about how a researcher, would navigate. Being inside NIH, there are so many mechanisms. We have to also remind ourselves of all of the different mechanisms. So I think a researcher should definitely talk to their program officer, because a program officer also helps the researcher navigate NIH and may help them, point them to a different mechanism than what the researcher was thinking. And just because, being a program officer, you kind of know the inside and what would make the most sense, what would have a better chance of, being funded. So I think having a conversation with the program officer before, and a lot of researchers do that, but that I think it should be encouraged more to have that sort of conversation with your program officer.
Great point. Caleb, can you go to the slide that showed that showed the annual funding for Down syndrome research? Right there, yeah, right there. Just a quick question. I think that it says this. It looks like the bar for 2014 was higher than the previous year. But then I think it says the next one, 2015, says 24.3 million. Is that correct? Where the bar is? I mean, or is that I saw the blue? So the blue bar is the number of projects that are being funded, right?
Number of the bar. Yeah, that's a good point. We're just looking at.
I think it's the bar, unfortunately, because I know we went up about 9 million.
Yeah. All right. I just wasn't sure if there was something.
No, thank you for pointing that out.
I didn't point it out. One of our great questioners pointed
All right.
it out.
One of your great questioners. Thank you for pointing it out.
Eagle eye.
That's right.
Yeah. And I don't know. I'll throw out one more question because I think we're getting close to 5 o'clock, and I know you guys have lives and it's a Friday night. I'm grateful for this, but I thought this was an interesting question. And then all the other questions, I will work with Lisa to make sure we get the appropriate answers for you. But one question was, what does NIH factually know about, I guess, the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's?
So factually, I mean, I think that link has been well established through a variety of different methods. One of the ways in which we know about this link is through studying people who have developed Alzheimer's disease, who have Down syndrome, and comparing what their brains look like to people who don't have Down syndrome and develop Alzheimer's disease. And we see the same sorts of what we call beta amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the brains of people with Down syndrome who develop Alzheimer's disease and those who don't have Down syndrome. So I think if you look at it from a pathology perspective, there are a lot of similarities. We also know that the gene that encodes the beta amyloid precursor protein, so this is really the protein that is found in those plaques, is found on chromosome 21. And we think that having 3 copies of this particular gene actually predisposes to an earlier age of onset of Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, there's another line of evidence that really comes from some of the animal models that are being used to study Down syndrome and looking at whether they develop some of the manifestations of Alzheimer's disease, both in their brains and then behaviorally, and that's been shown as well. So it seems that there is a very strong association between having 3 copies of chromosome 21 and probably in particular the beta amyloid gene and developing Alzheimer's disease.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, so it's 4:59 Eastern. I just want to thank you all again for taking the time to do this. Just a reminder, good, I'm glad you put up the DS Connect, that's the email for DS Connect, but for those who are looking to go onto the DS Connect website, it's dsconnect.nih.gov. We encourage people to go in there and if possible, register. On that registry, it's important that we all do that. We will have this webinar will be up on our, as I mentioned, up on our YouTube page as soon as we get it worked out. So you can go back and the slides will be there as well, so you can review it at your leisure over the weekend or whenever. And so, we are, again, we had this was an amazing week, I think, for people with Down syndrome in the area of science and research. I think I think what happened there in that hearing is moving the needle in terms of helping members of Congress understand, and value people with Down syndrome. We are grateful for our partners at NIH who take the time, work with our research community and work with all of our advocacy organizations to make sure that that people with Down syndrome are being treated fairly in the research arena. And as proof of that, again, they're here late on a Friday afternoon. So thank you all. Thank you to our friends from NIH. Thank you all for participating in this webinar, and we look forward to working with you going forward.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Have a great weekend.